The Guo Gong case. A minister's last stand against treachery. In the waning light of a late Qing winter, the palace courtyards looked like sheets of hammered silver. Snow clung to the eaves of the forbidden city, and the bronze lions at Meridian Gate wore pale caps of frost. Somewhere deep within that labyrinth of corridors and screens, a single candle burned in a small study, and beside it sat a man in plain dark robes, his hair touched with gray at the temples. His name was Guo Gong. To common folk, he was a rare thing in those years, a righteous official. To certain ministers who kept their books in secret ink, he was an obstacle that had to be removed. On his desk lay a map of the northern frontier, grain depots circled in ink, river routes marked with thin lines, and a scatter of small crimson dots where shipments had simply vanished. Reports from the border spoke of hungry soldiers and villages thinning like smoke. Guo had followed the numbers for weeks, tracing shortfalls through layers of clerks and contracts until they arrived, again and again, at the same conclusion. Someone at court was selling the empire by the handful. A soft knock. His young aide, Zhang Lin, entered, cheeks reddened by the cold. "My lord," he whispered, shutting the door behind him, "we intercepted a wagon tonight near Shijimen. The seal on the crates was yours, but the contents were not." Guo lifted the wax and cloth from a bundle. Inside the crate, supposedly filled with millet, was sand, heavy enough to fool scales at a glance, useless to anyone starving at the frontier. He closed the lid, steady but silent. To forge seals and swap grain on routes he personally supervised meant the rot was close, perhaps within arm's reach of his own desk. Before dawn, a summons arrived, court at first bell. In the Hall of Supreme Harmony, beneath lacquered beams painted with clouds and dragons, officials took their places like pieces on a board. Minister Zhao, fox-eyed, smooth-voiced, stepped forward with a sheaf of ledgers and a bow that bent him just enough to show respect, but not submission. "Your Majesty," Zhao began, "the Northern Army starves. Grain from the capital depots has failed to arrive. It grieves me to say, the ledgers point to the Office of Military Provisions." He raised the bound papers. "To Lord Guo." A murmur washed through the hall. The Emperor's gaze shifted to Guo, unreadable. Guo bowed. "If grain has vanished, the thief stands not in the open, Your Majesty, but in the shadow of your throne. I ask only for the right to investigate without interference." "Interference?" Zhao's smile did not touch his eyes. Bold words, from a man whose own storerooms concealed chests of silver. Laughter, thin and nervous, flickered among the ranks. Guo said nothing. Words were cheap in that room. Proof was the only coin that spent. By nightfall, imperial investigators, Zhao's own men, were ransacking Guo's residence. They tore the linings from cabinets, shook ancestral scrolls from their cases, spilled ink like blood across the floor. In the rear storeroom, they found 2 chests. When pried open, they glittered with Sisi silver and ledger slips that claimed to be Guo's secret receipts. Zhang Lin stood rigid as a spear. "Those chests weren't there yesterday." "I know," Guo answered quietly, "but today, they are." He sent Zhang Lin away with a sealed letter and a command to travel fast, by night where possible, and to keep to the courier alleys no minister used unless desperate. "Find Captain Bao at the Juyong Pass, show him the seal and ask for the musters. If our numbers are true, the frontier records will match them. If they don't, then the border has been starved twice, once by thieves and once by the hand that commands them." The trial was swift. Witnesses stood forward like actors on a stage. a warehouse guard who swore he'd seen Guo's aide moving chests by lantern light, a clerk who produced receipts with Guo's stamp, a carter who wept and claimed he'd been ordered to haul empty sacks north. Each testimony fit too cleanly, like stones cut by the same mason. Guo's answers were even, sometimes too calm to reassure his friends. "I will not argue against a script already written," he said once when the magistrate pressed him. "I will only say this: truth is quieter than silver, but it endures longer." They sentenced him to death by strangulation, the execution set for the morning of the first thaw. Winter, it seemed, would have the last word. In the prison, cold lived in the stones. Guards wore extra padding and still shivered. Guo was given a single quilt and a stool. He used the stool to prop a scroll upon his knees and copied characters by lamplight, not because anyone would read them, but because the hand that writes a straight line cannot shake with fear at the same time. One evening, Zhang Lin returned, boots rimed with frost, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. "My lord, I found Captain Bao. He gave me the musters. Rations recorded at the pass are less than half the amount stamped at the capital depots. And there's a second set of ledgers, hidden under floorboards, where losses are tallied against shipments diverted into private carts. The seal on the diversion orders isn't yours." Guo looked up. "Whose, then?" Zhang's voice was barely a breath. "Minister Zhao's private sign." They both knew what that meant. Truth is a blade. Drawn in a small room, it cuts whoever holds it. "Listen," Guo said, and his voice softened as it rarely did. "There is an archivist in the Court of Imperial Supplies, an old man named Shen, with eyebrows like broom bristles and a memory better than paper. Find him. Give him Bao's records and a copy of these notes." He tapped the scroll he had been copying. "Shen cannot save a living man, but he can save a name." "Your name?" Zhang asked. "The army's," Guo said, "and perhaps, one day, mine." On the last night, a figure appeared outside the bars, a woman in a lined cloak, her face pale in lamplight. It was Guo's daughter, Rui. The guard pretended not to see her, which was the kindest thing he could have done. "Father," she said, gripping the bars, "people say we should beg. That mercy can be bought." "Mercy," Guo said, smiling faintly, "is the one thing no merchant truly sells. Go home. Keep the household ledgers and the recipes for the winter medicines. Burn the rest. I would not have you inherit enemies." She pressed her forehead to the iron. "If you had not spoken, would you have lived?" "If I had not spoken," he said, "someone else would have starved." Dawn came colorless. At Meridian Gate, the crowd gathered in heavy silence. Snow squeaked underfoot. Breath rose in plumes. The executioner worked quickly. Hands practiced. Guo looked past the arch of the gate toward the invisible line where the road north vanished into mountains. "May the grain reach those who need it," he said, "and may the names on the false ledgers choke the throats that spoke them." The rope drew tight. For a moment, the world seemed to lean, then right itself again. The officials dispersed like crows. Minister Zhao returned to his mansion to drink hot wine and accept congratulations. That night, when he lifted the lid from a lacquer tray, a folded scrap of paper lay on the porcelain dish where a dumpling should have been. No signature, only a single character written with a firm hand. Bay North. He did not sleep well. Spring crept over the capital like a cautious animal, and with it came whispers. In the archives, Master Shen the archivist requested additional paper and time in the vaults. He sorted requisitions by route and season, copying them in his own cramped hand. Clerks grumbled at his fussiness. He kept working. At the Juyong Pass, Captain Bao drilled his men with an anger that frightened them into discipline and courage both. He sealed copies of his musters with wax mixed with a pinch of crushed millet and sent them south by separate messengers. One along the official road, one along a river path used by muleteers, and one tucked into the false bottom of a tea chest, carried by a singing girl who owed him a favor from better days. In the markets of Beijing, children sang a new playground rhyme about sand in grain sacks and a minister who loved silver more than rice. The rhyme had a lilt to it. Servants whispered that it reached the inner chambers before anyone dared say the name aloud. Summer brought heat and flies. It brought, too, a hungry riot at a frontier garrison where soldiers who had received half rations for too long finally snapped. The skirmish was put down with blood, but the report that reached the throne was not written by Zhao's men. It was written by a junior inspector from the censorate who had never been taught how to bow to silence. He attached, almost by accident, copies of Master Shen's summaries and Captain Bao's musters. The emperor read late. Those who saw him afterward said the veins at his temple stood out like inked cords. Zhao was called to present himself at dawn. He went in silk and came out in chains. The inquiry that followed was not clean. Nothing that clawed through that many layers of filth could be. Names surfaced and sank. Some men vanished to monasteries. Others fell sick and never recovered. A few hanged themselves with belts that had never before been used. The ledger slips produced at Guo's trial were found to be clever forgeries. A carver of seals disappeared from the city one night, and no one looked hard for him. An order was issued quietly, with no drum or trumpet. Guo Gong's sentence was to be voided posthumously. His name restored, his household stipends returned, his descendants permitted to hold office if they wished. Rui knelt and wept over the decree, not because it was enough, but because the state's thin apology was the only currency it possessed. Zhang Lin brought fresh paper and incense to the small ancestral shrine. He set Guo's scrolls within, laid a bowl of millet beside the spirit tablet, and bowed until his forehead touched the floor. People say that in that year's harvest, the northern fields bent heavy with grain, and the soldiers at the passes ate until their eyes shone. This is foolish talk. Harvests obey weather, not justice. And yet, in tea houses and roadside inns, when the story of Guo Gong is told, the listeners always lean forward at the same place. The moment when a quiet man chose to hold a line, others had already stepped over. And they always leave with the same feeling, like the sting of snow on skin and the burn of hot wine in Phoebe Chin, the throat. That honor may die, but it does not disappear. Years later, on a cold morning that smelled of river mud and wood smoke, an old archivist with broom-bristle eyebrows shuffled into a temple courtyard and lit a single stick of incense. "For a name," he said, "and for the men who eat, because that name was not for sale." Then Master Shen tucked his hands into his sleeves and walked away, vanishing into the ordinary day, the only victory a scribe can claim.